Venerable Mahasangha, Reverend Father, Principal of Anand College, Mr. Kirti Sadhana, my good friend, the President of the OBA, the members at the head table, and committee members of the OBA, distinguished invitees, fellow Anandians, ladies and gentlemen. Before I deliver the oration, let me make a few announcements on this oration. The first, I would like to acknowledge the support I received in drafting the oration from my colleague, Dr. Chandra Thamarasekara, and his team from the Central Bank of Sri Lanka and the Economic Research Department. And second, I have declared the views expressed here are my own, not necessarily reflect the views of the Central Bank. With that, let me begin. The topic, evolution of monetary and exchange policy in Sri Lanka and the way forward. I am deeply honored to have been invited to deliver the Olcott Oration 2017 and to join a list of great Anandians who have delivered this oration before. I cannot think of a greater honor that my school could confer on me. I accepted this invitation with humbleness, with gratitude and respect, and with great pride. Let me also take this opportunity to appreciate the support and guidance I received during my school career at Anand College. The guidance our teachers gave us laid the foundation for any success later in our lives. My oration today is on a rather technical topic of monetary and exchange rate policy. The biggest challenge that I have faced today is to present such a topic to an audience with a majority who might not be familiar with the technical jargon and all. However, I will attempt to keep the discussion as simple as possible, and also with the help of some of the pictures and the slides that will guide you through the presentation, the help of my colleagues at the Central Bank. Let me first move into the first part of the presentation, Central Banking and Price Stability, just to set the stage for the operation. The prime responsibility of any central bank around the world is to maintain price stability by way of maintaining low and stable inflation on a sustainable basis. At the outset, I would like to discuss why low and stable inflation is important for growth and stability of the economy. Based on experiences of many countries and different time periods, we have seen varying level of inflation. When countries experience hyperinflation, those prices of goods and services will rise every minute. In such a situation, no one will want to hold local currency, and people will rush straight from bank to the shops to buy goods, fearing that their currency holdings will lose value along the way. In fact, the banking system itself will collapse as people lose faith in local currency. The barter system or the exchange of goods for goods or services will become the norm, making transactions significantly more difficult. Hyperinflation will also cause adverse redistributive effects, destroying real value of middle-class savings in local currency and real incomes of fixed income earners, such as workers and pensioners. One can read horror stories of hyperinflation in Germany and Australia in the 1920s, and more recently in several Latin American countries and also in countries like Zimbabwe. The episodes of hyperinflation in the interwar Germany is said to have facilitated the rise of Hitler and the global disruption that followed. The famous economist, author Neil Irwin, in his book titled, quote, "The Alchemist, Three Central Bankers in a World on Fire," unquote, called the governor of the German Reichsbank at the time the worst central banker in the history. Let us also look at the other extreme case of price movements, namely deflation, which is declining of prices. The example that will come into anyone's mind is Japan, which underwent what was known as the lost decades. Now it is termed the lost 20 years. Since the early 1990s, Japan experienced deflation, the continued declining prices of goods and services. One may think this is great, But what could be considered good for a consumer in that short term may not be good for the entire economy, as evidenced by the experience of Japan. Since then, Japanese economy had experienced negative economic growth, a drop in nominal GDP, declining wages, and negative real interest rates. Some indications of sustained growth in Japan are only seen now. Fortunately, Sri Lanka has never experienced such episodes in the past, and clearly we won't need a hyperinflation, no deflation even in the future. But what about double-digit inflation, hovering around 10 to 20%, as experienced in Sri Lanka for several decades from 1970s? Empirical evidence clearly shows that this kind of double-digit inflation is bad for sustained growth. High and volatile inflation causes lenders like banks and other financial institutions to demand a higher fixed interest rates on loans to compensate for the risk that inflation will move around, thus raising the cost of finance for investment. At the same time, the financial institutions need to offer higher nominal and real interest rates to encourage savers to deposit their money to mitigate the risk of high and volatile inflation, eroding the real value of their savings. High and volatile inflation increases the margin between lending rates and deposits, and this high cost of financial intermediation penalizes both savers and the borrowers. High and volatile inflation encourages workers to bargain for higher wages. High and volatile inflation also prompts producers and sellers in the economy to add higher markups in pricing of goods and services. The combined result of this self-fulfilling cycle will be lower economic growth, higher current account deficits, depleting reserves, and volatile exchange rates, and the country will end up with commercial capitalist class of buyers and sellers of imported goods or class of middlemen. Then the question is, what is the appropriate level of low and stable inflation, which will result in more desirable outcomes? Most advanced economies set their inflation target in the low single digit, around 2%, as you can see in the charts. Countries like UK, New Zealand, and the USA. Within emerging market and developing economies, the targets are slightly higher. The Philippines and Chile target 2 to 4% as a desirable level of inflation. Indonesia 2.5 to 4.5%, Brazil 4.5%, South Africa 3 to 6%, while India targets 2 to 6% of inflation. It must be noted here that the central bank could only effectively control demand-driven, what we call demand-driven inflation. Central banks could do little to address short-term disruptions to prices due to adverse domestic supply developments like droughts and floods, or unexpected international commodity price movements like oil price hikes globally. However, central bank responses will be required to contain demand-driven inflation, usually identified by movement in what we call core inflation or underlying inflation. Then let's move on to what are the monetary policy framework that will help us to bring the inflation to a low and stable level. In order to maintain low and stable single-digit inflation, central banks around the world are entrusted with the task of conducting monetary policy with varying degree of independence. Central banks use various monetary policy frameworks to operationalize the achievement of the end objective of price stability using the policy tools given to central banks. Monetary policy frameworks differ across countries depending on country-specific circumstances such as the level of financial market sophistication, openness of the economy, strength, capacities and independence of institutions, etc. For example, monetary policy frameworks in some countries are based on currency board arrangements, where on the left-hand side on top is a currency board arrangement. That's where the starting point, where the value of domestic currency is strictly pegged to an international currency. In currency board arrangement, domestic inflation is directly linked to inflation of the country which its currency is pegged. For example, in the US, US dollar, or in the UK, sterling pound. And then the anchor for inflation will be the exchange rates. In such strict exchange rate targeting regimes, the country's business cycles in terms of growth and inflation will be fully synchronized with the other countries' business cycles. In these countries, monetary authorities, like central banks, have very little leeway to use monetary policy as a counter-cyclical policy measures to stabilize growth and inflation in the domestic economy. In the other extreme end, the monetary framework has several ends. So one of the extreme end, is the monetary policy frameworks are based on fully fledged inflation targeting regimes. That's it on the left hand, the right hand side, the green box, the inflation targeting regime. Under this arrangement, the exchange rate acts as the shock absorber to minimize the impact of external shocks on real economy. In such regimes, central banks have more autonomy to use interest rates as an instrument to counter cyclical economic shocks. There are many central banks that have a combination of those two extremes. There are others are in between those two extremes, a combination of those two. One cannot argue that one regime is superior to the other. It all depends on country circumstances, and even within one country, monetary policy frameworks move in different directions at different times. Monetary aggregate targeting framework fall between these two extreme regimes depending on their extent of exchange rate flexibility of such regimes. Then let's look at our Sri Lanka experience, the evolution of Sri Lanka monetary policy in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka's monetary policy framework has also evolved from a currency board arrangement as a one extreme end at the beginning in 1950. The history has been well covered about this at the beginning of the central bank in the masterpiece called From a Dependent Currency to Central Bank in Ceylon, unquote, written by eminent Professor H.A.D. Gunasekara, in whose honor one of my retired central bank colleagues, I can see him here, Dr. Kolomage, delivered an eloquent speech recently. From 1950 to 1977, Sri Lanka's monetary policy framework was largely based on maintaining fixed exchange rate regime in terms of fixing value of Sri Lanka rupee first to the Australian pound and then to the US dollar. Under this fixed exchange rate regime, domestic inflation was directly linked to foreign inflation, and therefore there was no need for an explicit monetary anchor to manage inflation. Central bank did not have much leeway to control domestic inflation as a fixed exchange regime was anchored to manage inflation, local inflation. Like many other things, inflation was also more or less imported from the United Kingdom in those days. This system worked well as long as Sri Lanka earned sufficient foreign exchange to meet expenditure on imports without any restriction. For example, during the periods of export booms, particularly in the early 1950s that we can see Korean rubber boom, the fixed exchange rate regime worked well as foreign exchange earnings which arose due to external factors rather than domestic export promoting policies were not only sufficient to meet current expenditure but also helped build up foreign resources so that the currency peg, the fixed exchange regime, could be maintained without foreign grants or without more borrowings. The necessary condition for any country to maintain a currency peg with a strong reserve currency like sterling pound on a sustainable basis is the country's ability to earn foreign exchange. Remember, it's to earn foreign exchange, not to borrow foreign exchange. In other words, such a country would require a strong set of export-oriented policies and run at least a balanced current account, what we call current account in the balance of payments, on a long-term basis for it to be able to maintain a peg with a strong foreign currency. Economies like Japan early on, and later Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, and even China, given their strong export-oriented policies, were able not only to generate current account surpluses on a sustainable basis, but as a result also saw the value of their currencies appreciating against major currencies like sterling pound and the US dollar. During the period of Sri Lanka's fixed exchange rate regime, successive governments did not pursue export-oriented policies continuously. There were short episodes where policies focused on export promotion, but there were more times of policy reversals towards encouraging import substitution and inward-looking policies. From a long-term perspective, such policies were inconsistent with the need to maintain a fixed exchange rate regime. Under these circumstances, the key challenge the central bank had to face was how to defend the exchange rate peg against policies which did not promote exports. The only choice available at the time was for the central bank was to restrict the use of available foreign reserves and impose severe exchange control restrictions those days. Some of you can remember the exchange control restriction that country had those days before 1977. In a way, the central bank at the time was successful in maintaining low inflation because it was imported from somewhere, which is the one key responsibility of the central bank, but it failed to support the multiple objectives which are often in conflict with each other of the then central bank. So you can see some of the charts where the 50 to 1977 period, we had a low inflation, low growth, low inflation, but with severe restriction of foreign exchange and relatively large current account deficits. So there was curtailing growth, although we met inflation on a consistent basis during those periods. Then living standard, improving standards were pretty low during all this period. In addition to pursuing inward-looking economic policies, successive governments also ran high budget deficits, mainly to provide subsidies and various free entitlements. Such budget deficits, even at moderate level, caused more demand for imports in the midst of weak export performance, creating continued current account deficits in the balance of payments. While the central bank was required to maintain a fixed exchange rate regime, this was an impossible task for the central bank. As a result, central bank from time to time either devalued the rupee or maintained a dual exchange rate along with the severe restrictions on use of foreign exchange. This monopoly framework lacked credibility and created severe distortion in market pricing. At the same time, on the global front, the collapse of Bretton Woods system, with the United States declaring in 1977 that it would cease to redeem US dollar for gold from its reserves, challenged the system of fixed exchange regimes globally that the global economy was used to operate in at that time. In addition, the 1973 oil price hike caused inflation to escalate in all countries, including Sri Lanka, often resulting in a destructive wage price spiral. In Sri Lanka, inflation increased to 14.4% by December 1973, as we already saw in the chart, the highest level of inflation of the country experienced until then during the post-independent history. So even during that period, we had a high oil price shock, which raised inflation about 10%, even in the fixed exchange rate regime. Elsewhere in the world, following the collapse of Bretton Woods systems of exchange rates, the international community was getting used to floating exchange rates, where each country's value was determined by the international demand for the currency. This was a new normal, prior to which money has historically been based on a valuable commodity such as gold. Now, in November 1977, Sri Lanka embarked on a major economic liberalization move, making paradigm shift from inward-looking restrictive policies towards a liberal regime under which trade and payments were liberalized to a great extent. To be consistent with the new liberal regime, the central bank abandoned the fixed exchange rate regime and moved to a more market-based system of exchange rate management. On 15 November 1977, the prevailing dual exchange rates were unified at an initial rate of rupees 16 that time against the US dollar. This was an overnight devaluation of the basic exchange rate by 120%. The rupee was then allowed to float under a managed exchange rate regime. Accordingly, compared to the end of 1977 exchange rate of rupees 8.83 cents per dollar, the exchange rate was recorded at rupees 15.56 in 1977. That was the beginning of a new regime from 1977 onwards. This sharp devaluation addressed the evolution, what we call evolution of the rupee, observed under fixed exchange rate regime earlier. The subsequent managed exchange rate regime allows some flexibility to determine the value of currency, largely on the basis of market demand and supply, while attempting to prevent the overvaluation of the rupee by maintaining the real value of the rupee against movement of a basket of currencies. Instead of one currency, that we maintain the valuation or the competitiveness against a basket of major currencies. The introduction of the managed floating exchange rate was a welcome move from the perspective of a liberal macroeconomist. However, this resulted in new challenges to the conduct of monetary policy, particularly as the exchange rate was no longer available to anchor inflation expectations like in the past. The central bank also had to face a further challenge as the government started to run extremely large fiscal deficits, funded mainly by concessional external funding to develop public infrastructure, such as you can all remember, the accelerated Mahalir scheme, like large infrastructure development projects. Annual fiscal deficits during that period averaged 13.3% of GDP between 1978 and 1983. If you compare the current fiscal deficit government is trying to maintain around 5%, this was 13.3% deficit for continuously was 4, 5, 6 years. So as a result, the year-on-year inflation was average 15.6%. It's a high double-digit inflation during February 1978 to January 1985. During this period, there was a peak of 32.5% inflation in August 1980. So inflation that year increased by inflation was 32.5, which means prices increased by 32% within financial year, within a 12-month period. It must also be mentioned here that rising inflation at that time was the main cause for the 1980 general strike, which resulted in over 40,000 public and private sector workers losing their jobs. So little wonder that Central Bank of Sri Lanka started looking for a new framework to contain inflation and inflation expectations in the absence of a fake exchange rate system. This is where Central Bank started to begin what we call monetary aggregate framework in targeting inflation from around 1980s. The relationship between monetary expansion, which is money that we putting out or printing out by the central bank in terms of amount of money held by the public, and inflation has been well recognized in Sri Lanka from beginning of central banking in the country. However, the first mentioning of desired monetary targets in a central bank annual report in Sri Lanka could be found in 1982. The 1982 annual report says that, quote, having taken into consideration the real growth, the estimated rate of price increase and increased monetization of the economy, the desired monetary targets were set in the National Credit Plan with a view to maintaining the consistency between financial and real output flows in the economy. The monetary targets were then translated into a permissive level of credit to the private sector by commercial banks, and after allowing for the impact of the behavior of the external sector and the credit requirements of the governments. Unquote. This looks like kind of a technical jargon. I think probably people who can read Sri Lanka Central Bank annual reports can understand. A lot of people find it very difficult to understand. This is a classic characterization of an annual monetary program, which is a crucial element in monetary aggregate targeting, what they call monetary targeting framework. On what this is based on? Based on Irving Fisher, is a famous monetary economist. His quantitative theory of money, monetary aggregates, which is amount of money that public are holding on, these monetary aggregates targeting to explain the relationship between money growth and nominal economic growth. What we call nominal economic growth is the combination of real economic growth and inflation. The real economic growth is 5%, inflation is 6%, nominal economic growth is 11%. That is how we look at the nominal economic growth. In this framework, as monetary policy instruments attempt to influence the final objective of inflation by first affecting monetary aggregates, broad money supply, which is the money held by public, broad money supply was considered the intermediate target. For operational purposes, the reserve money or base money, that is money that central bank is printing, the reserve money, which could be influenced and monitored by the central bank on a daily basis. This was considered the operating target. So that is where we central bank can control, and there's operating target. When you print that 1 rupee, commercial bank can create another 5 rupees through their accounting systems. So the operating target and the intermediate target both being monetary aggregates were linked to each other through money multiplier. So this is the simple sketch of how the monetary targeting framework works. Basically starting from this chain, we use policy instruments, those are available, and target the reserve money, that money we print out, and then the money that commercial banking sector creates, the broad money, and finally that will affect the economic growth and inflation. That is basically the simple framework that central bank has been adopting, what we call monetary aggregate framework. While monetary aggregate targeting remained the framework for the conduct of monetary policy in Sri Lanka, the exchange rate regime also underwent a gradual evolution. The managed floating exchange rate system broadly remained a crawling band arrangement, as the margin associated with the foreign exchange transaction was increased from time to time. The degree of central bank intervention in the foreign exchange market varied over time with the balance of payment developments and the view of the central bank on of the direction of the exchange rates. Under this monetary targeting framework, with what we call crawling peg exchange rate, with exchange rate was daily moved under crawling peg system, achieving price stability proved challenging, again, because the successive governments continued to run high fiscal deficits even after the completion of the Accelerator Mahavidya scheme to finance large-scale housing and road development programs. In addition, the 3 decades of ethnic conflict required successive governments to spend more money on defense expenditure. In order to maintain competitiveness of the rupee, the central bank had to let the currency depreciate to at least partly compensate for the inflation differential between Sri Lanka and its trading partners under this crawling peg system. You can see the exchange rate, how that has moved from 1957 to 7. The fixed exchange rate regime was pretty stable fixed exchange rate regime. And after that, the exchange rate started to depreciate at a little higher rates during 1977 to up until the next period. And major cause for this large depreciation is not necessarily the way that we manage the exchange rate. It's basically coming from the, you can see the fiscal deficits. The fiscal deficits earlier, it was on average about 1.5%. Now it came down to very high fiscal, an average 10% fiscal deficit over a period of 30 years. And as a result, the balance of payment current account was under heavy, large deficits. So the only solution for the central bank was to let the currency depreciate. Otherwise, it would be a successive balance of payment crisis that the country could have gone like Zimbabwe if we did not manage that way. So, even though this arrangement helped to alleviate the adverse impact of on export to some extent, so when we allow the currency to adjust or depreciate, that will help to a certain extent to the exports. However, high domestic demand created through excessive fiscal deficits led to large current account deficits in the balance of payments, making it difficult to maintain even this crawling peg arrangement without a sharp depreciation. So by the year 2000, Sri Lanka experienced a significant decline in its official international reserves as a result of considerable increase in expenditure on imports. The increased demand for foreign exchange placed tremendous pressure on the exchange rate. Within the managed floating exchange rate regime, this naturally resulted in increased pressure on international reserves. In order to defend the managed float, the central bank raised its policy interest rates to unprecedented levels, like 22% at that time, which later proved not only to be an unsuccessful exercise but also a costly experiment, which largely contributed to the only negative annual GDP growth rate of the country's history, negative 1.5% in 2001. This prompted the central bank to revisit its exchange rate policy. There's another significant change was introduced on 23rd of January 2001. The central bank took a major step of allowing the commercial banks to determine the exchange rate, and the central bank refrained from announcing the daily crawling buying and selling rates of foreign exchange, thus allowing freer exchange rate foreign exchange transactions. The change in the exchange rate at that time resulted in an overshooting effect, with the rupee depreciating by rupees 13 from rupees 90 per US dollar within first 3 days, but relatively quick stabilization of the exchange rate followed under the more floating exchange rate regime. As the use of monetary policy to defend foreign exchange was no longer necessary under the floating exchange rate regime at that time, the Central Bank of Sri Lanka was able to conduct monetary policy with an increased focus on achieving the bank's objective of price stability. However, maintenance of price stability came under heavy pressure under this regime whenever aggregate demand was excessive as a sort of expansionary fiscal policies. Therefore, at times of such excessive demand through fiscal dominance, the Central Bank of Sri Lanka intervened in the financial market to defend the exchange rate from depreciation. Although this was done with good intention of maintaining macroeconomic stability in the difficult times, experience repeatedly showed that managing the exchange rate extensively was always associated with a substantial loss of limited international reserves, followed by a larger depreciation. So that not only we lost our resources but also ended up with a sharp depreciation. The most recent of such events were in 2011 and 12 and 2015. During 2011 and 12 episode, Central Bank supplied or intervened in the forex market by supplying US dollar 4.2 billion to the market on a net basis. So we had a resource of 6 billion, we supplied 4.2 billion to the market to maintain or defend the exchange rate. And on the second episode in 2015, Central Bank, during the episode, Central Bank supplied another $2.1 billion to the market on net basis during the episode, and subsequently for the whole year, we spent $3.2 billion to defend the exchange rate at that time, in 2015 also. In spite of this considerable loss of reserves, the rupee depreciated against the US dollar by 13.5% by the end 2011 and 12 episode, and by 9% during 2015. That's what I mentioned, we not only lost reserves but also depreciated the currency. Since then, the central bank has explicitly announced that the international resource will not be used to defend an overvalued exchange rate. This is an important statement which was made recently. Instead, the central bank intervention in the foreign exchange market will aim to build up international resources. So far, during 2017, the central bank has been able to purchase for $1.3 billion. These are purchases, not borrowings, purchase from the market on a net basis for this purpose, and improved market confidence in the forex market that is shown by the limited depreciation of currency this year so far in 2017. Now let's move back to the monetary policy. During that period, what was the monetary policy framework and what are the challenges that we had to face? Returning to the previous discussion, it was clear by the late 1990s and early 2000s that a serious rethink of central banking in Sri Lanka was necessary. In addition to the increasingly popular view within the international central banking academic circles that the price stability must be overriding objective of central bank, financial innovations, including the development of electronic payments and fund transfer systems, also prompted the central bank to upgrade its view on financial system stability. These factors, as well as many others which are beyond the purview of this page, prompted the Central Bank of Sri Lanka modernization project, resulting in legislative, procedural and operational changes in relation to central banking in Sri Lanka. With regard to the legislative changes, the amendments to the Monroe Act, what we call MLA, in 2002, were the most important. Accordingly, the multiple objectives of the original MLA, which included stabilization and development objectives, as well as maintaining domestic and external value of the rupee, were streamlined to define the core objectives of the central bank as maintaining economic and price stability and financial system stability. So there are two key main objectives. We are focusing on two of those objectives. By this time, the central bank had gradually moved away from direct controls to market-based tools of monetary policy implementation, a process which started with the adoption of open economic policies since 1977. The significant advancement in monetary policy operations during this period was the introduction of what we call repurchase rate and reverse repurchase rate of the central bank. This looks technical. This is the central bank policy. These are the central bank policy rates. These two rates served as a floor and the ceiling for movements of interbank called money market rates. The policy interest rate corridor was used from the early 2000s to signal changes in monetary policy stance of the central bank. Today, this policy rate corridor is called the standing rate corridor, with the floor and the ceiling rates being known respectively as the standing deposit facility rate and the standing lending facility rate of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. These are the two rates central bank lend money to commercial banks. Open market operations are conducted in a more active auction-based framework with overnight, short-term and long-term operations to maintain market liquidity, thereby market interest is in line with the announced monetary policy stance of the central bank. The key operational changes to the conduct of monetary policy included the establishment of what we call Monetary Policy Committee of the Central Bank in 2001 to strengthen monetary policy analysis and to improve the transparency of the decision making of monetary policy. Central Bank also began issuing regular press releases on monetary policy decisions to the public based on an advanced press release calendar. So everyone knows when we are going to announce the next monetary policy decision now. This press release was often then followed by a press conference chaired by the governor and accompanied by the senior official of the central bank. So that's why you see every month or once in 2 months of media conferences announcing our monetary policy framework and the decisions. Central Bank also introduced what's called Monetary Policy Consultative Committee, enabling the central bank to obtain views of the private sector to be used in the monetary policy formulation process. In addition, the central bank started to enunciate its monetary and financial policies for a medium-term horizon through a roadmap which was unveiled at the beginning of each year. So we also started to announce what our policies within the next year or so. So what is the result of all this enhanced and improvements that we introduced, or central bank introduced since 2000 after the modernization? So if you can see the next period that I analyze here in the oration, in spite of this modification of the framework of conducting monetary policy over time, Sri Lanka continued to suffer from double-digit inflation until 2009. So the first period until 2009, we had a double-digit inflation. As a combined outcome of why we had this, as a combined outcome of high budget deficits, loose fiscal policy, reactive rather than proactive monetary policy, frequent domestic supply disruptions, international commodity price shocks, as I mentioned earlier, the oil price shocks. And in June 2008, as a result, inflation increased to 28.2%, the highest level of inflation since 1980s. You can see the peak, 28.2% somewhere in 2008. So in order to manage this situation within the monetary targeting framework, that still we were operating on the monetary targeting framework, the central bank used strict quantitative monetary targets with the increased policy interest rates, while also imposing restrictions on access to the central bank reverse repurchase facility. In a display of validity of monetary targeting, the central bank was able at that time to bring down inflation from the peak of near zero levels within a 12-month period. So you can see the sharp decline within 12-month period back in 2008 and 9. It was the sharpest disinflation the country has experienced in the history of Sri Lanka. But it must also be noted that the weak global commodity price also contributed to this decline to a certain extent. Nevertheless, the intent of the central bank to maintain inflation at mid-single digits, which mid-single digits means around 5 to 6%, enabled the central bank to change the mindset of the people that Sri Lanka is typically an economy with double-digit inflation. The change in the mindset was visible in improving inflation expectations. Since February 2009, inflation has remained in single digits. You can see the inflation remained below 10% since February 2009, so for 105 months. It's considered as an achievement in the history of central banking in Sri Lanka. However, now we look at why monetary targeting framework is not feasible going forward. However, Sri Lanka's achievement of single-digit inflation for 105 consecutive months, as I shown earlier, had little to do with monetary aggregate targeting framework that we were operating at that time. From July 2009 to September 2017, the year-on-year, the money growth, which is money held by the public, was on average 17.1%. So every year, money held by public was growing at around 17%. But the inflation, year-on inflation during the same period was only around 5.2%. So there is a kind of a distortion here. Based on the earlier discussed Fisher's quantitative theory of money, the gap between these two figures, that is 11.9%, must reflect annual economic average growth during this period. If this theory works, then we should have, if money was growing at 17%, impulse of 5%, we should have had 11% real economic growth, but actual was around 6%. You can see in this chart, the first period monetary targeting framework, the money and nominal GDP and money was growing at almost same rate. That is where monetary targeting framework works perfectly. But later, after 2009, you can see the gap widen. And there's no strong correlation between the nominal GDP and the broad money, the money held by the public. So which is the evidence that monetary targeting framework is no longer feasible or viable. This was sufficient evidence that the strong and reliable relationship between the goal of price stability and the nominal anchor of money growth, which was essential for the success of the monetary targeting framework, has significantly weakened over time. This phenomena was not limited to Sri Lanka, but was observed over time in many other countries as well. With the ending of monetary aggregate targeting in Canada as early as in 1982, Gerald Bowie, Bank of Canada governor at the time, famously stated, quote, "We did not abandon monetary aggregates abandoned us," unquote. Even the recent experience with the quantitative easing in many advanced economies yet again proved that the tremendous expansion of central bank balance sheets, as what they call quantitative easing or printing money by US Fed and other central banks around the world, that these countries, the undertook was insufficient still to raise growth or inflation. With a lot of printing money, still growth or inflation did not occur. Earlier it was argued that Sri Lanka's achievement of single-digit inflation for 105 consecutive months had little to do with monetary aggregate targeting framework that we were operating. Instead, it was a result of the central bank's ability to anchor inflation expectations by repeatedly emphasizing its utmost desire to maintain inflation at mid-single-digit levels. The behavior of the central bank during 2008 to 9 episode of that large disinflation would have raised credibility of monetary policy. Improved communication also would have played a key role in this achievement. It must be noted that the neighboring economies struggled with double-digit inflation during some parts of the same period. For example, India was unable to tame inflation until 2014. One might argue that international commodity prices were in our favor. However, this was not always true, as global crude oil prices remained on average above $100 per barrel during the period from February 2011 to September 2014. So this was the episode. Then, based on our experience, now this is where what is the next step of the monetary policy targeting, what we call inflation targeting as an alternate, and lessons what we can learn lessons from the other countries. Therefore, without a formal announcement, Central Bank of Sri Lanka, similar to many other central banks in the world, has moved to a monetary policy framework governed by expectations and credibility rather than by monetary aggregates or exchange rates. In the global economy, such a monetary policy framework that emphasized the role of expectations and credibility existed, and it was known as inflation targeting, that I briefly referred to at the beginning. First adopted by New Zealand in 1990, inflation targeting was chosen as the monetary policy framework in Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and Sweden in quick succession. Encouraged by the success of inflation targeting, a number of other advanced economies as well as emerging market economies adopted this framework thereafter. These countries use inflation targeting regime either to bring down inflation from a stubbornly high levels to maintain inflation at low and stable levels on a sustained basis. This is just experience of the countries that adopted inflation targeting. So as you can see the green line. On the left of the green line is the period where monetary policy framework was not based on inflation targeting. The right of the green line is the period where countries adopted inflation targeting as the monetary policy framework. You can see very stable, low and stable inflation, continuous basis throughout the period. That is where I think what we want to achieve going forward. Inflation targeting is generally characterized by an announced inflation target, an inflation forecast which facilitates forward-looking monetary policy decision making, and a high degree of transparency and accountability. According to Lars Svensson, the Swedish economist who later served as deputy governor of the Riksbank, the Central Bank of Sweden, this policy framework encompasses a trinity of a mandate for price stability, independence, and accountability for the central banks, which enables anchoring of inflation expectations very effectively. In practice, inflation targeting is flexible rather than strict. The strict inflation targeter would be who Mervyn King, the former governor of the Bank of England, called an inflation nutter. According to Svensson, flexible inflation targeting means that monetary policy aims at stabilizing both inflation around the inflation target and the real economy, whereas strict inflation targeting, what they call strict inflation targeting, which aims at only stabilizing inflation with little regard to the stability of the real economy. So they're looking at only the inflation, not looking at the real economic growth. Most of the central banks do not only aim at stabilizing inflation around an inflation target, but also put an effort into stabilizing real economic variables. This effort is described by the time horizon in achieving the inflation target, which dampens the adverse impact of policies on the real economy. Therefore, an important feature of flexible, what we call flexible inflation targeting, is that the inflation rate will be on average at target, but perhaps not every month. The key advantage of inflation targeting is that it is easier for the general public to relate to. Since inflation is well understood by the public, the inflation forecast will serve as an ideal anchor, and with improved communication will help bridge the information gap between the central bank and the public. Reference to such straightforward target rather than an elusive monetary target that we had earlier will ensure increased transparency and accountability while enabling the public to understand policy shortcomings. Global experience has also shown that in adopting inflation targeting, country needs to fulfill several prerequisites, particularly in terms of the legal and institutional framework. This includes central bank independence and a strong mandate for price stability, strong fiscal position with freedom from fiscal dominance, a flexible exchange rate regime, well-developed financial system, a sound technical infrastructure for inflation forecasting, and transparent policies to build accountability and credibility of the central bank. So do we have all of this? This is where we want to go actually. In particular, with regard to the fiscal dominance, other countries had developed mechanisms to stop monetary financing of fiscal deficits, particularly through subscribing to government securities auction and the provision of interest-free funds to the government through an advance account, as observed in Sri Lanka in the past, even now. Instead, the other central banks purchase government securities from the secondary market to influence monetary conditions as and when necessary. Now then, what's the road to inflation targeting going forward? That's the final part of my presentation. Considering the success of flexible inflation targeting in advanced and emerging markets, the Central Bank of Sri Lanka also considered this as the best framework to be adopted in the medium term. The number of prerequisites for the new framework have already been fulfilled by the Central Bank and the government during the past few years, with the view of moving towards what we call flexible inflation targeting regime in the medium term. At present, an interim arrangement, the Central Bank conducts its monetary policy with what we call with an enhanced framework, which features both monetary aggregate targeting and also flexible inflation targeting. Under this enhanced monetary policy framework, the Central Bank focuses on stabilizing inflation in mid-single digits, which is around 4-6% for the medium term, while supporting the growth objective and flexibility in the exchange rate management. Although the central bank does not announce any monetary targets explicitly, broad money aggregates remain a key indicative intermediate variable to guide the conduct of monetary policy. As accurate forecasts of inflation and other key variables are essential for the success of inflation targeting, so we should be able to accurately forecast inflation and growth if we have success. Macroeconomic projection capabilities of central bank currently being strengthened. As an important step toward building technical infrastructure for the successful implementation of flexible inflation targeting, what we call a forecasting and policy analysis system, short known as FOS, has been developed by the central bank with the assistance of the International Monetary Fund. This system is currently being integrated into the monetary policy formulation process of the central bank. Following the best practices on inflation targets, number of monetary policy committee meetings now has also been reduced to 8 meetings per year in order to provide the technical staff sufficient time for them to have a deeper macroeconomic analysis. Several other recent policy changes will also support the implementation of flexible inflation targeting in the medium term. The central bank has implemented a more market-based exchange rate policy during recent times, with limited intervention, as I mentioned earlier, in the financial market. There has been a build-up of international resources with minimal impact on the exchange rate. In tandem, the financial system has continued to expand whilst exhibiting resilience amidst challenging market conditions, both globally and domestically. The implementation of what we call Basel III framework for the banking system will further enhance the resilience of the financial system. And also, a deep and more liquid government securities market is also prerequisite for smoother transmission of central bank policy rate signals to the market interest rates, as yield on government securities form benchmark medium to long-term interest rates. So our policy rates transmit to the market through government securities yield rates. In this regard, the recently introduced system of rule-based and more transparent treasury bond auctions has not only reduced sharp volatility in yields on government securities, but also corrected the distortion between central bank policy rates and market interest rates that existed earlier. This mechanism has also helped reduce monetization of the fiscal deficits through purchasing treasury bills by the central bank at private auctions, as what happened earlier. For example, the central bank holdings of treasury bills have declined drastically this year from more than rupees 300 billion, exactly 330 billion at the beginning of this year, but we were holding treasury bills. But some people call that amount of money that we printed during this period. In 2016, we had 300 billion. It has come down to around 40 billion now. In fact, now the number is 30 billion. It's a drastic reduction of what the money that we printed through fiscal dominance or by purchasing treasury bills. As the new system, new bond and bill auction system ensures full market subscription through the auction system without creating adverse volatility in interest rates. The other component of this same reform is the proposed Liability Management Act allows the Treasury to create a buffer fund to make the expenditure in the following year, eliminating the necessity for the central bank to provide advances to the Treasury at the beginning of each year as per current provision of the Nandalal Act. So there are two channels. One is to be our subscription at the private auction. Second one is to be our commitment to give them advance at the beginning of the year based on the revenue targets. Those both can be addressed through those two reforms. These two measures would in future insulate monetary policy from fiscal dominance. These reforms are expected to create a win-win situation for both the central bank and the Treasury, as they would facilitate the Treasury to raise required fund at least possible cost from a more sophisticated government securities market at competitive rates, while helping the central bank to achieve its private objective of maintaining price stability. So, looking forward to the future, in the roadmap, in our roadmap in 2017, which we presented to the public at the early beginning of the year, the Central Bank of Sri Lanka reiterated its intention to move to flexible inflation targeting in the medium term as its new monetary policy framework. The government has also endorsed this move since then and stated in its recently released Vision 2025 policy document that I quote, "For medium to long-term price stability, the central bank will move towards a flexible inflation targeting regime. They will aim at continuously maintaining low inflation while supporting economic activity and competitiveness. Government will implement the legislative and operational changes necessary." Unquote. While it is heartening to note that the central bank and the government have agreed in principle that flexible inflation targeting is the way forward in the conduct of monetary policy, the full implementation of flexible inflation targeting regime by the year 2020 will require increased efforts to fulfill the remaining prerequisites for the success of inflation targeting regime. It's also expected that comprehensive amendments will be made to the Nandalal Act to facilitate the transition to flexible inflation targeting to redefine monetary policy objectives, eliminate monetary financing of fiscal deficits, and ensure central bank autonomy and public accountability. This is important. Independence as well as accountability comes together. Amendments to the Nandalal Act are also expected to streamline the monetary policy decision-making process. Within the central bank, the ongoing upgrade of technical forecasting and analytical capabilities will continue, and it is expected that by 2020, the central bank will commence the publication of comprehensive inflation reports. That is a common feature in inflation targeting countries, but published inflation reports. The inflation report will explain inflation developments, inflation expectations, projections for inflation, and other key macroeconomic variables. The assumptions behind such projections, if there is a deviation, reasons for any deviation of actual inflation developments and from target levels, and also remedial actions that should be taken in the case of deviations. Such transparency and accountability is likely to enhance the credibility of the central bank and will anchor inflation expectations, resulting in increased economic stability, supporting high economic growth and increased international competitiveness of Sri Lanka. Meanwhile, continued commitment by the government towards greater fiscal discipline and a strong fiscal position remains key to the successful adoption of flexible inflation targeting. Therefore, the central bank will continue to support government's efforts to reduce the debt to GDP ratio to 70% by 2020 and curtail budget deficit at 3.5% of GDP from 2020. The government's intention to strengthen the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act is also very encouraging in this regard. Finally, in conclusion, I'd like to take you back to the beginning of central banking in Sri Lanka in 1949. John Exter, another American who made a significant contribution to the Sri Lankan economy. He is a founder of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka back in 1950. In his report, called the Report on the Establishment of the Central Bank of Ceylon, unquote, he made this statement. Quote, the decision of the government of Ceylon to establish the central bank was a decision with far-reaching implications for the people of Ceylon. In taking steps to establish an independent monetary system to be administered by a central bank, the government has demonstrated unmistakably its intention to achieve genuine economic freedom. It has been the endeavor of this report to propose a type of central bank which, with proper skills and understanding in its management, will establish monetary conditions in Ceylon that may make possible, as never before, the fuller use of the nation's human and material resources and a rising standard of comfort for all. Now you have history in front of us, you can judge us based on history, and also I will leave it up to you to judge us in the future as well. Thank you very much.